Hello everyone, this is Paul B, and I want to give you I want to explain the core moral problem I've had with Meannesota by using an example of what someone else has to say on this kind of issue. I'm going to play you a couple of somewhat extended interview segments with what I would consider to be one of the very few true American heroes who are out there today. And unfortunately, the fact that I just called this person an American hero immediately makes me think that you probably have not even heard this person's name. And that's the first problem that I really want to point out. You should know this person's name. And with all due respect, if you were awake and you were paying attention, and if you just cared, you would have known this person's name, because their name is out there. It's not on television. It's not on the side of a beer can. When you go snowmobiling, you're not going to hear it. When you take your kids to soccer practice, you're not going to hear this name. But if you cared about your country, if you cared about your political leadership, especially when they are apathetic, negligent, incompetent, and corrupt, when they're damaging your nation and the nation that you're going to leave behind for your children, if you cared about those things, you would have found this person's name. Her name is Sibel Edmonds, and in 2002 she was fired by the FBI for blowing the whistle on the FBI's surveillance of American citizens, and specifically of members of Congress, illegally abusing the FISA court. And again, if you don't know what a FISA court is, I'm almost tempted not to say with all due respect, because there isn't a lot of respect due there. You should know what a FISA court is if you're a citizen of the United States of America. If you feel like you're entitled to anything, including roads and national defense from invasion by another country, if you feel you're entitled to that at all as a citizen, you should know what FISA is. And if you don't know what FISA is, then you are asleep at the wheel as a citizen. And I'm sorry I have to be this blunt about it, but that's where we're at. FISA is that kangaroo court that's set up in total secrecy, where if they want to do surveillance on a citizen, they can go there and get essentially a search warrant to do surveillance on somebody. But because it's basically a rubber stamp, they don't really need to provide any particular pretense. They can just say, well, we think they're involved in terrorism, even though what they're really trying to do is to gather dirt on people for the purpose of blackmailing. Now, I have talked about corruption in our government throughout my Third World American project, 1996 to 2006. Similar things in Meannesota. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but that's another reason I am so furiously angry about what has happened to me. And it's another reason why people don't understand why I'm so furiously angry about it. What I'm hoping is that these few clips of an interview with Sibel will help you understand. What I'm hoping she will do is convict you of your own negligence and apathy in these matters. Because she's going to point out what it means to be a decent human being, what it means to be a moral, decent human being, a person who is worthy of some kind of respect and admiration, particularly as a citizen. Because if we live in a free country at all, we all have to participate in this. And I don't mean voting for one of the two gangsters that they gave you to vote for. I mean getting out there and being a citizen to the extent that you're able. And if you have kids, you have no excuse. Sibel has a child herself. And yet, if you see what she's doing to try to save this country, to try to save your children and your children's children from living under a totalitarian system, you have no excuse for doing nothing or for not caring. And you have no excuse for ignoring what I've been saying all along about what's going on in Meannesota, because that is basically a microcosm of the national issues that she's dealing with. Now, I dealt with those national issues throughout Third World America. That was what's going on in Washington. And the corruption there is so mind-boggling. That's one reason I essentially had shell shock, as if I had been at war, when I moved to Minnesota and retired Third World American. It took me, and I say it right there on my website, I say it, and people have read it, but they don't understand what I'm talking about when I say it. They just gloss right over it. But I said, when I arrived in Minnesota, I felt as if I had been at war for the last 10 years, because I had been. I had been defending this nation as a citizen while everyone around me is asleep at the wheel, drinking beer, driving around on snowmobiles, watching television, caring anything about the Kardashians, taking their kids to soccer and hockey practice instead of raising their children to be decent people and good citizens. I was out doing the work, like people like Sibel were doing. Very few people do it. When I moved to Minnesota, they call it post-traumatic stress disorder today. I hate those psychological terms. What they're describing is what used to just be called shell shock. It's what happens when you go to war and you have explosions all around you and you see people being blown up all around you and body parts flying all around you. That is what I saw, effectively, in a domestic sense, throughout that 10-year Third World American project. When I got to Minnesota, I had to rest and relax and try to get over that and try to come to terms with what I had seen. And the worst thing I had seen at all, again, my website says this already, the worst thing of all I saw was when I had to come to the conclusion that it was not these corrupt gangsters, pedophiles at the highest levels of our government. It was not those people who were ultimately the problem with this country's decline. It was Joe Average, Jane Average on the street who did absolutely nothing but watch television, drink beer, take the kids to practice. They did nothing. They don't even want to hear it. And if I tried to speak about it, they got mad at me. And I'm the one who's trying to defend them. Sibel has encountered the exact same thing. She's certainly not the only one, but there are relatively few people out there even attempting these things. I want to play you a couple extended clips, and I'm going to comment on how they relate to Meannesota, the website, and what I have gone through on such a limited scale. Remember, the problem I had was simply that my neighbors were noisy, and yet my entire life was destroyed by this. And people say, how can that happen? Well, first things first. The reason is because I did not come home and watch television and drink beer. I came home from work, working very hard, usually extra hours with no extra pay, often doing other people's jobs for them, who were paid a lot more than me. And after all that, I would come home and I would go work again. I didn't even own a television set. I didn't have internet access. When I was at home, I was working. I was working on these kinds of issues. Many of these kinds of issues, juggling them all, doing the research, writing, trying to get the word out, trying to make sure your kids don't live under an American Soviet Union. That's what I was doing. And you know what? That requires concentration. It requires the ability to think critically, requires the ability to focus and zero in on things, to come up with creative ways to present this and creative ways to integrate and synthesize all this information so that I see things that other people aren't seeing, because I'm looking at all these different things and I see what's in common. I see the comparisons and the contrasts, and I can come up with understanding of it that other people don't see because they don't put that much effort into it. Well, when my neighbors got extremely noisy, they interrupted all of that. And my website defines scientifically how that happens. How a big boom takes all the blood immediately from your brain and sends it to your muscles, because your body is in fight or flight mode. And whatever you were just thinking about is gone, and it's going to be gone for quite a while. And yet these people went boom all the time, all day, all night. They brought my work to a complete halt. That is why the noise destroyed my life. If all I was a vegetable who sat around and watched television and drank beer, these people wouldn't have had any effect on me, because I wouldn't be doing anything that could be interrupted. So that's the first things first. And I'm sorry if you don't like hearing that. I'm sorry if that makes you feel uncomfortable because it convicts you of the fact that you're doing absolutely nothing. But that's the way it is. That's what I was doing. That's what I've done my entire adult life. That is why the noise interrupted me so much. It's because I was doing something that could be interrupted. Then you have the science, as I just mentioned, of what fight or flight does to your body and all the other things that go with it. And then when you start having people blaming the victim and saying things like you're hypersensitive to noise, where when they say I'm hypersensitive to noise, they're just not even comprehending what it means to do something with your life that can be interrupted. How am I supposed to respond to that? When I have a landlord who sits around, watches television, drinks beer, whatever it is he's doing, he sure as hell isn't being a good citizen. He isn't even a good landlord. He's not doing anything that could possibly be interrupted. So for him to just sit there and say, well, you're hypersensitive to noise, it just shows his complete ignorance, his complete and utter irresponsibility as a human being, not just as a citizen or a landlord. Just a useless human being, such that he can't even comprehend of the fact that this noise is interrupting me and destroying all the work I'm trying to do. It's not because I'm hypersensitive to noise. It's because the noise is interrupting something where other people do nothing. And again, my website has pointed this out. Read the profile of the adult child and others. It points out how you just hear their television on 24 hours a day. That's all they do. So of course the noise doesn't bother them. What are you going to interrupt? What are you going to interrupt? They're not doing anything. Their brains aren't even turned on. They're in an alpha state all the time. You can't interrupt a zombie. I'm no zombie. That's why the noise interrupted me. And I have every right to do that kind of stuff at home. Everybody has a responsibility to do that stuff to some degree at home, but almost nobody does it. I did it. And that's why the noise interrupted me so much. And this is after I had spent 2 years basically relaxing and getting over that shell shock from the whole 10 years of Third World American. And then I started up again. So I'm doing all of this work. I'm one of those gadflies who's out there. And if you don't know what a gadfly, when I say gadfly, if you don't know what I'm referring to when I say that, if you don't know the origin of that phrase, once again, you have failed to learn the fundamental basics of Western civilization. If you don't know that gadfly should immediately conjure up the name Socrates in your mind, you have failed to learn the basic fundamentals of the history of Western civilization. Open a book and learn what a gadfly is. Because we need more gadflies. That's the only way we're going to save this country. That's the only way Meannesota is going to be annihilated, leaving behind 5 million good and decent people in Minnesota, instead of this mean, vicious, rotten, almost demonic cult that runs Minnesota, that permeates every aspect of Minnesota society and culture and politics and business and media. We need gadflies out there. Now in this first clip, Sibel is going to basically discuss what it means to live under a representative government when our representatives in government are scum. Now the very first minute or so of this might seem a little confusing to you. It may sound as though I've jumped into it in the middle of a discussion. Please just listen to what she says and I will explain that at the end, but I'd rather that you heard the clip first. So here you go.
Open chapter 3. They're going to be staring at this chapter, reading a chapter about the U.S. House Whip. It's a congressman who is a pedophile and who is being monitored by various groups, agencies, and reading, when they read this, which this book came out a year and a half ago, it was written 3 years ago, it was the only way I had, not having high power attorneys like Dennis Hastert, to put out the truth, even if I had to fictionalize it. And to see this years after years and after years remaining covered up, and today, in the age of internet with the social media channels out there, to see that people are still refusing to pay attention to the truth that hits them in the face and is out there documented. It's been on the record for over 10 years. To me, that is the most discouraging and I would say frightening reality, because for a long time here at Boiling Frogs Post, we talked about apathy, why people are becoming so apathetic. We talked about and referred to moral ambiguity that we are seeing all around us. But with this case, with this Dennis Hastert case, now with what we are putting out there and the lack of reaction, I would say we really have gone from moral ambiguity to moral decay. When you have people seeing someone that they consider their representative, someone who represented the people of the United States in Congress, and dozens of others, because that was part of my testimony and it is still today, being criminal, not only financially, but also being pedophiles, rapists. I mean, what does it say, Spiro, about the people? Because people can't have it both ways. Many Americans are so proud and they say, yeah, even though it's not perfect, we have a representative government. Okay. If, as Americans, we say we have a representative government, and if with that we are saying these people represent us, and if these people are pedophiles and crooks and criminals, which most American people actually will admit, say, yeah, they are all scumbag criminal politicians, what do you expect? Well, if you say they represent us, and at the same time you say, what do you expect? They are crooks and pedophiles and rapists. Then you are saying we are represented by these people. What does it say about us? You know what I'm getting at here?
Yes.
Because you either have to say this is not a representative government, and I'm not going to get involved in this voting process because they are giving me two sides of the same coin. They're giving me who I consider to be all dirty scumbags, crooks. Well, if you vote, and if you say I'm represented, and if you say I have a representative government, then in a way you are saying we are all Dennis Hasterts. We are a nation of moral decay. We are a nation that approves of crookery and being criminal and being a pedophile. And I think maybe that's the hard thing for people to want to look at, not to see, because it's right in front of their eyes, and that goes beyond and above apathy, unfortunately.
Sure. The people putting up with this.
All right, so obviously Sibel is trying to make the point that if we have scumbags in public office, the fault ultimately lies with the voters who put them there. And more to the point, if we have totally degenerate, morally degenerate scumbags in public office, and yet those public officials are chosen as representatives of the voters by the voters, that tells us something about the voters. In other words, if we have a bunch of financial criminals and fascists and pedophiles in public office, what does that say about the people who willingly chose to go to the ballot box and to check a box next to that individual's name? In a representative form of government, you're supposed to vote for the people who you believe represent your character and morality and sensibilities and attitudes and beliefs, and who represent the direction that you want your state or your country to go, or your community, better than all the others. That's the one you vote for. And yet, look at the people we have in office. What does that say about the people who voted for them? She's talking about it at the national level, and specifically that first part, she's discussing her book, The Last Gladio, which is a fiction book that she wrote because she had a gag order on her that did not allow her to tell the true story. So she wrote a fictionalized account of it instead. But here's the true story. The true story that she blew the whistle on is that the FBI and 3 other agencies were conducting surveillance on the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, because, not just for financial crimes, but because he really, really, really enjoyed having sex with children. In fact, he spent taxpayers' dollars to fly to Southeast Asia so that he could just rape little boys and girls to his heart's content. As far as I understand this, they even imported children into the United States of America for the specific purpose of allowing him to have sex with them and to distribute those children as political gifts to other high-ranking officials in Washington, D.C. When I say high-ranking officials, I mean the people whose faces you see on television. Dennis Hastert, as Speaker of the House of Representatives, was third in line to become President of the United States. If anything had happened to the President and the Vice President, that pedophile would have been the President of the United States. And what she's saying, what Sibel is saying here, is that if those are the people who are elected to public office, what does that say about the people who elected them to public office? Since Dennis Hastert ostensibly represents the people of, can you believe it, Illinois, the same political machine that Barack Obama came from. You know, people, if Americans do not wake up and decide to take a little responsibility for their own governance instead of just checking a box every once in a while, they're going to get exactly what they deserve. And the problem is, so am I, and so are their children. And so are their children's children. All of us are going to get what these lazy voters deserve. Now, as this relates to Meannesota, throughout my website, all along, from the very beginning, I pointed out that as devastating as my neighbor's noise was, because it brought my work to a complete halt, it brought my enjoyment of home completely to a halt. It just incapacitated me at home. Despite that, the part that really created trauma that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life is what happened after that. It's when I spent 3 years going to every level of Minnesota government, from the very bottom to the very top, and not having one of those public officials do their jobs and stop this noise, or take action against my landlord who refused to enforce the lease that he and I had signed, a legal agreement. In 3 years, not one of these public officials did their jobs. And in fact, the more I pushed for it, the more they started covering for each other. Likewise with the media. The Minnesota media refuses to publicize what happened to me in order to protect these corrupt, negligent, incompetent, apathetic government officials. It's just corruption to the core. Left to right, top to bottom, front to back. It's just pure, undistilled corruption. That's Meannesota. And Meannesota is the dominant cult in the state of Minnesota. The question is, how did all those public officials who refused to do their jobs get into office? Well, they were put there by voters. The voters are Minnesotans. Now, if these officials are supposedly representatives of the voters, that means that the voters are a bunch of lazy, amoral, corrupt, negligent, apathetic, incompetent bums. Right? That's the point Sibel's making here. And it's the point I was trying to make all along, even going back to my Third World American Project, which is that it isn't just the corrupt government officials who are the problem. It isn't just the corrupt corporations who are the problem. It's the 300 million Americans who refuse to do anything about it. And I don't care if they just come out and say, well, it's too big of a problem, I don't see what we can do about it, it's hopeless. That doesn't impress me. That doesn't impress me. Our ancestors revolted against the British Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire, and yet our ancestors revolted against them, and we only had something like 5% of the population that participated in that revolution, and yet they pulled it off, and the other 95% of the population benefited from it. The problem is, nobody takes any action today. I do. Sibel does. There's a handful of others out there who do, both known and unknown. But the average person on the street, and certainly the average Minnesotan, does absolutely nothing. But the reason I really like this clip is because of two things she said in particular. And I quote, With the lack of reaction, we really have gone from moral ambiguity to moral decay. And then she also said, quote, "This goes above and beyond apathy." You know, a lot of people throughout my ordeal, they'll just casually remark, yeah, people are pretty apathetic about all this stuff. And I have gotten so upset with that because I have seen apathy. And this goes way above and beyond apathy. We are at the level of total moral degeneracy. When even my friends and my coworkers and people who know me and know my character and they work closely to me every day, when even they don't get the slightest bit upset about the way I was treated by all of these officials, it doesn't even bother them. They don't. There's no sense of outrage. They're not upset. They're not angry. They're not furious. Certainly not to the point where they would ever take any action whatsoever. When you reach that level, where people who sit right next to me every single day, they're not outraged when someone who's that close to them has their life destroyed right in front of their eyes. They don't even feel upset about it, not even bothered by it. At that point, you're beyond apathy. That is not apathy. That is total moral degeneracy. That is a complete loss of morality. It's just gone. And apathy is not the lack of morality. It's the lack of concern and care. That's what we're dealing with both at the national level that Sibel describes and in Meannesota. Complete moral degeneracy among the rank and file people on the ground who elect people who represent them to public office, and that's why you have that complete and utter moral degeneracy in public officials. And with that, let's go to the second clip from Sibel. This one is 7 minutes long, so it's rather extended, but what she has to say is very important. She makes several points here, and again, when she's done, I'll point out how it relates to Meannesota.
In your destiny and in your governance, etc. And those are all true. But at the same time, you know, I have a master's degree in public policy. People tend to respect people who use really big words. For example, I can come and talk about using utilitarian method to explain the decline of the agrarian society, and people are going to go like, "Whoa, whoa! Listen, look, we're listening to an expert." But when somebody comes and puts out a simple word like decency, that becomes like, oh, what's that? That's just such a low level. People actually can't even use in media the word decency. And I know it may sound irrelevant, but the other day, I'm a mother. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I was looking and reviewing this report it's a GAO report, and that says kids between the age 6 and 14 in public schools, okay, 15% of them get to be molested or raped while they're in school, whether it's by some coach like Dennis Hastert, or a teacher, or a counselor, or a janitor, etc. And GAO says it's much higher, the actual number, because these are only the reported case, okay? So you're looking at the kids that go to school and they get raped and molested. And then I was looking at this report on the percentage of women who get raped and attacked in colleges and universities, and it just goes throughout the years, and you're looking at some ridiculous number like 25-30%. Let's say some of them are frivolous, but you're still in that number of 20-25%. You look at the regular child abuse percentage. We look at all these realities on the ground and then say, well, I would say Dennis Hastert represented at least then 30% of this people who bring about these cases, because that is that loss, the decline of that decency. And I'm not talking about decency in that evangelical sense. I'm talking about people not having moral ambiguity, but have real moral principles and taking action based on moral principles. And disappearance of that has been getting my attention, saying, let's wait a second and say, I know a lot of things are from top to bottom, but let's see how much of this is caused and is bottom up. Because when you're looking at people and their inaction and they're shrugging, saying that, oh yeah, a pedophile represented our country, and not out there saying, we want this case, we want to know none of this, and start looking at how most people actually implement principles in their own lives, are we going to see a significant correlation? And pause and say, we have to look inwards too. It's really, even though it's not easy per se, but it's easy to point finger and say, let's look at all the crooks and the scumbags who are in Congress. Okay, here, look at our government, all these financial execs that got away after 2008. How many of them went to jail? How many of them, Spiro, were brought into justice? None, right? What did we do as people? We accepted it, right?
Yeah.
You know, that 2008 crash, how many people were held liable? None. Zero. Okay? So it's to say, let's look inwards and say, what is wrong with us? Because you are doing what you're doing with your channel. So I am not counting you as one of those majority. You are not one of them. You are one of us. But then what's our number? Because it seems like we are such minute minority when majority says actually it's fine, or they say it's disgusting. And I know some people are going to bring up this case of learned helplessness. They feel they are powerless, but I've always been all my life for personal responsibility, and then to take action. And you can't just hide behind excuses and say all these crooks are running, why don't good people run? Guess what, Spiro? You and I come up with 4 real good candidates, decent people, but also solid, right? And use the internet medium and your video and our website and say, here, people, here they are. And you will see that you will end up with the same 1,500 or 5,000 people who are supporting our networks, the real alternative medias. Even if they see the majorities, they're not going to touch, because it has gotten to a point where people say those decent, good people are not electable.
Yeah.
They don't have that charisma. We want wolves, you know. We really want to put the foxes in charge of our hen house, because, as you said, they have been brainwashed systematically for so long that it has gotten to this stage. It's the death of outrage. It's the death of reaction. It's the death of personal responsibility. And it's a death of decency with it. And again, I don't want to put it in some terms of, oh, I'm having a religious ceremony here, but I think it's time to go back and bring back some of those words and put it out there. And one of those words is decency, human decency.
It's been a long time since I've heard that word, to be honest with you. And you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100% on that. We see it on a daily basis. A lot of us. I mean, none of us are perfect, you know, without a doubt. But we can all be aware of the situation that we're in and be aware of ourselves and strive towards improvements. And people need to hold people accountable. They need to hold themselves accountable as well. This country absolutely is in a lot of trouble, and you're right that people have been brainwashed to a great extent to accept this, to accept the decay of our society, our culture, everything, every aspect of it. And it's been done incrementally, and the criminal system this has allowed the criminal system to get away with everything. Murder, you name it, literally, to get away with everything. And yeah, absolutely, at the end of the day, they do represent the people, and it's a scary thing.
All right, now I think what Sibel just said pretty much speaks for itself. So in terms of Meannesota, throughout my website, throughout my videos, and frankly throughout my speech as I spoke to individuals about this, starting with my landlord all the way up and all the way out through YouTube, I have always used the word decency and human decency. In fact, at the very beginning, when I dealt with my landlord, that's exactly what I said, is you have no human decency. It's perfectly natural for me to frame this in terms of decency because that's what it's about. And yet, again, our society has decayed to such a point that just human decency doesn't seem like anything important enough to even think about or talk about. And yet, what do we have without human decency? I could go before the city council and point out that that police officer who came over into my home and did absolutely nothing and refused to do his job and suggested that maybe if I moved out, that would be the solution rather than him doing his job. If I were to say to the city council that that cop has no human decency, it would just blow off of them as if I just said, that cop's a jerk. You know, that cop's a jerk. What does that mean? I don't even know what that means. You're calling him a name. It's not a good name. But beyond that, it has no specific meaning. But when you say somebody has no human decency, that's an accusation that you need to be able to back up because it's a serious one. If someone has no human decency, they are a threat to society. They are a menace to society. And depending on how much power they have, they could be a threat to all of humanity. Human decency is one of the most important character traits that anybody needs to have, let alone leaders and people in power and authority. And yet, throughout my time in Meannesota, I've never seen human decency. Little speckles of it once in a while. But there's nothing about this culture in Meannesota that involves human decency. And in fact, Meannesota hates human decency. This is where you have to distinguish between Minnesota and Meannesota. In Minnesota, I have met people who have displayed wonderful human decency, the same kind I've seen elsewhere. You know, Pam W. helping me move from my apartment, and the people who've helped me since I've been homeless on occasion. I mean, I've seen incredible kindness and generosity, human decency. Those are Minnesotans. But Minnesotans, which is that dominant cult, and that is the cult that dominates politics, business, the corporate world, the legal system, the mass media, the education system in Minnesota, no human decency at all. In fact, it's a characteristic of Minnesota that it is devoid of human decency. My website, my speech, my videos have been making this point all along, and yet it bounces off of people as if I'm just saying Minnesotans are jerks. Well, you know what? If I say Minnesotans are jerks, that really means next to nothing. But if I say they have no human decency, you need to wake up and understand that what I'm saying is something you need to pay attention to. Because these people affect the lives of 5 million people in Minnesota, and their representatives, if you recall the last clip from Sibel, their representatives in our federal government have direct impact over your life, no matter which state of the union you live in. So you better pay attention to whether or not the representatives of these Minnesotans have any human decency, or if they have absolute contempt for the very concept of human decency. And that, unfortunately, is the case. Now also, at the tail end of this clip, I included the response from the interviewer, and he agrees with her, and he says, People have been brainwashed to accept the decay of every aspect of our society, and this allows them to get away with total corruption. This is the point. If the media, which is one reason I despise the Minnesota media for being as corrupt as it is, because they inundate Minnesotans daily with language, and just by the fact of what they publicize versus what they choose not to publicize, they are conditioning people to interpret the world around them in a certain way. If the Minnesota media only put stories in the news about how their corrupt government was destroying the lives of Minnesotans, then all Minnesotans would be walking around all day conscious of that fact, and they would be thinking about what they can do to put a stop to that, because that's what's on their mind all the time. But the Minnesota media instead puts up these stupid news stories about football, Viking Stadium, and I just got interviewed the other day. I was out cleaning off some people's cars because they were really nice to me, so I was cleaning the snow off their cars, to say thank you. And Channel 5 came over with a camera and pointed it at me and started asking me questions. And I'm thinking, I'm sleeping in that car over there because you have the most corrupt government I've ever seen, corrupt state government. And instead of reporting on that, you want to report on me clearing off a car of snow during a blizzard. How is that news? But the fact that I'm sleeping in a car over there and that I had my life completely destroyed, how is that not news? And the guy just didn't even blink. Didn't even matter to him. He just wanted some video footage of someone brushing off a car. Just a contemptible, disgusting news media in Meannesota. But when that is what Minnesotans are exposed to all day, every day, throughout their media, throughout their culture, from their government, from their educators, then that's the way that they view the world. They view the world as if Minnesota was a place where they don't have some horribly corrupt and incompetent government, when the reality is that they do have a horribly incompetent, negligent, and corrupt government. And that's what Corbett's pointing out here, is that people become, what he calls it, brainwashed. That word always scares me because it gives a little more power to the manipulators than they deserve. But the fact is, in terms of just conditioning people to focus their attention on this over here rather than that over there. For example, we think about terrorism in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, the horrible terrorists who are going to hurt us, and since we are focused on that all the time, we don't pay attention to the fact, the documented, established fact, that the United States, since we took over Afghanistan, have established it as the heroin producing capital of the world, and that money is being used to finance things like, I don't know, Islamic State. But you know what? Americans aren't focused on that, because when they think Afghanistan, they think terrorist. They don't think oil pipeline. They don't think heroin trade, CIA. They think terrorist, because the media has conditioned them with this automatic response. If you hear the word Afghanistan, you will think the word terrorism immediately. First thing you'll think of. And that's what they're doing here in Minnesota, where they condition people to, if you come out and you point out just how corrupt it is here, especially in their government, people can't process it, because it's like, well, if it really was that corrupt, we would have been hearing about it in the media, and this wouldn't be like coming out of left field like it is from you. And it's like, well, that's true if you had a competent and an honest news media, but you don't. That's the whole point of corruption, you see, is that your news media is in bed with your government. That's why they don't tell you this stuff every day. Okay, next I'm going to play 3 shorter clips of Sibel on the Alex Jones show. And I'll just, of course, throw in the disclaimer that I am not a follower of Alex Jones. However, I do appreciate the fact that every once in a while he does conduct a very good interview with a very good interviewee. And that is the case here with Sibel. So let's just jump into the first segment.
Well, the most important thing is, what is our government doing? What has it been doing? And why they have been covering up what they have been doing for so long. Because, if you're not engaged in something really wrong, outrageous, you won't have this need to cover up. You won't have to classify 5 million documents every single day. That's what they do. There are billions of documents. These are government documents. This is supposed to be the government of the people, for the people, by the people. So if you have billions of documents kept secret, if you have the government who issues gag orders on government insiders who come forward and dare to report on government's own wrongdoing, criminal operations, criminal activities, waste, fraud, abuse, how can this government be a government of the people, for the people, by the people? You have all these classifications, all these cover-ups, you have gag orders. We have had, since Obama became president, we have had 7 government whistleblowers prosecuted. Look, even Dan Ellsberg didn't go to jail. And guess what? Outside Dan Ellsberg, we haven't had a whistleblower that has been indicted, ever. And just in this short period, we have had this president, the so-called liberal president, that has convicted 7 7 government whistleblowers. Their crime? Coming out, letting the public know that their government is engaged in criminal activities all over the world and here in the United States, whether it's torture, whether billions of dollars. Look at all these people who can't afford in our country to pay for their medical bills, okay? Look at the state of our schools, our libraries, and our government with all this deficit that we have, Alex, you know it. I mean, I don't want to be preaching to the choir here. Wasting every month billions of dollars. You know why? Because it is not accountable. One of the examples I give people is if you witness a crime, you know, murder, burglary, what do? Usually you go and take out your cell phone and you call the police. What if you witness your government, the police is committing some heinous crime? Who do you have to call? If you look at the federal courts since 9/11, find one case where the federal court has not sided with the government and helped the government cover up, whether by accepting secrecy and state secrets privilege or just plain going and indict a whistleblower.
And they have a name for that. It's called tyranny. Please continue.
All right, now there's two very important and relevant things in this last clip from Sibel. At the beginning, she talks about, again, she was a whistleblower with the FBI. She's talking about the billions of public documents that have been redacted and kept secret and classified, in most cases for no good reason, in terms of national security. In many cases, these things are kept secret for the sole purpose of protecting the government itself from being exposed for its criminal activity and from prosecution of those corrupt, negligent, incompetent government officials. Billions of documents, and she's also pointing out that President Obama has prosecuted whistleblowers aggressively, and yet whistleblowers are nothing more than people who tell the truth, people who try to expose what the people who are paying for all of this need to know. Barack Obama has prosecuted more whistleblowers than every single American president since George Washington combined. Now, the obvious implication of that, just common sense tells you right out of the gate that they have something to hide when they're aggressively going after the very people who are trying to tell the truth in a free society. Now, where this relates to me, if you go to my website and you look at under the cast, if you look at my former Meannesota employer, that's where this one comes into play. If you read the profile of my former Meannesota employer, you're going to find out that I cannot tell you anything about my former Meannesota employer. And there's a reason for that. And if you listen to what Sibel just said a moment ago, you might get just a glimpse and a glimmer of why that is. It isn't a good reason. Let me put it that way. It isn't a good reason. So read the profile of my former Meannesota employer on my website. I'll put a link on this description. And keep in mind that as I try to deal with the issues I'm dealing with in Meannesota, and I end up losing my job, and then I have to try to recover from that while I'm living in a torture chamber of these noisy neighbors who make my home life nothing but torture and torment and terror. And on top of all of that, the company I just worked for the previous 7 years, I can't say certain things about. And I can't even tell you why I can't say certain things about them. It's these kinds of things. The sick and twisted Meannesota legal system supports that kind of activity among corporations. And if you read the account that I give in the profile, you're going to find that this company made a lot of money after I left, and it made a lot of money in a certain sense because I and other people were thrown out of the company. Okay, now beyond that, I'm going to let you have to do the math. I'm going to have to let you put on your thinking cap and figure out what it is I'm trying to say. But again, it ain't nothing good. And this is Meannesota, and it is tied intimately in to the corrupt Minnesota government and the sick and twisted legal system that they have here. The second part that Sibel is talking about here, she asked the question, where, who do you go to if the police are the criminals that you're trying to report? She worked for the FBI. If the FBI is engaged in corruption and cover-ups, who do you go to? Because the FBI is the federal law enforcement agency. They're the ones who bring criminals to justice. Who do you go to? The reason this really struck me, this really hit home with me, throughout my website in many places, I can point you to one right away. In the sidebar on my website, Meannesota.com, you'll see a message called A Public Message to the Twin Cities News Media. And if you read that very important, what I think is a very important letter to the Minnesota news media, you'll see in there where I ask them the question, the police failed me. They failed me miserably. And in fact, I'm drawing this in the context of another neighbor dispute in New Brighton where the parties got shot and one of them killed by their neighbor. And I asked the question, when the police have become the problem, when the police have become the primary source of trauma and terror for me, and I'm holding a telephone in my hand and I'm being tormented inside my home by these lawbreakers, who do I call? Because I can't call the police. They are now have established themselves as part of the problem. And if you want to see why they're part of the problem, then go to the video Minnesota police fail or whatever I called it on my channel. You'll see a two-part. It's the police call I made to help with this noisy neighbor, and you'll hear that police officer blame the victim, exonerate the perpetrators, and do everything he possibly can to minimize his need to do anything at all other than go sit in his car and drink coffee and eat donuts. So after that experience, who do I call when the police and the city and the government becomes the problem? Originally, this was just a noisy neighbor issue. And again, it comes back to that question. Paul, how could noisy neighbors send you into homelessness and cost you everything you work for your life for? It's because this isn't just about noisy neighbors. It's about the response I got from the Minnesota government from the bottom to the top. And toward the bottom, in my case, were the New Brighton Police and the New Brighton City Council. They did absolutely nothing, and when they did nothing, they became the problem. And given what their responsibility is versus the responsibility of my neighbors, the city, the government became a bigger problem than my neighbors. They became a greater sense of pain and suffering and torment and torture for me. Greater of trauma. I've said it all along. I believe I say it on the website. I felt like I was raped by this government repeatedly. When you hear that officer tell me he's not going to do his job, I was being raped. And a lot of the website where I talk about trauma, I bring in the experiences of rape victims. And there's a reason for that. I'm not trying to sensationalize this. That is exactly how I felt. That is exactly how I feel as I sleep inside of a car while these government people who didn't do their jobs, who effectively raped me emotionally and spiritually and psychologically, they're still out there with their jobs, with their, well, so-called honor, making money. Now, remember, I just found these interviews as I was looking into what Sibel had to say. But throughout what these highly respectable American heroes have to say, they keep making the exact same points that my website, Meannesota.com, are making. They're making the same points that my previous Third World American project made. That's why I wanted to play you all these clips, to show you that the people who know what's going on in this world, who understand, who turn off their television, put down the beer, and actually investigate the reality of our world, they all tend to come to the same conclusions. And here's two of her conclusions. There's a bunch of secrecy and gag orders, and people are not allowed legally, and not by a corrupt legal system, they are not allowed to go out there and tell the truth about companies and governments that are engaged in horrible actions. And there's no one left to call when the authorities become the criminals. And with that, let's go on to the next clip from Sibel.
And this is also by design by many of these nonprofit organizations, industrial complex, because they have become an industry. Millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are being poured by those big 1% into these so-called NGOs. And these NGOs have not secret, open partnership with the government. They want whistleblowers to whine and to come out and say, I'm a victim. Look at me. Look what they've done to me. They ruined my life. Did they ruin my life? Yes. Did they fire me? Yes. But what I did with this book was to show people what government tried to do to the American people, what it has been doing to the American people, taking away their right to know. Because as long as people are uninformed, they can go on. They have been expanding. So I put in this one book, the book that government has been fighting for 383 days now. They have been saying you are not allowed to publish a single word in this book. My attorneys and I kept sending letters to them saying, cite a law. Oh, well, we're going to cite the classification. We have to redact them. We have to redact everything. I said, well, you had 30 days to do that. We are moving forward. We are armed, by our First Amendment is on our side, and we're going to do it. Because we have to push it. Every time we have an opportunity, we have to push it. If we just sit and take it, every day is going to get worse. Today, they started by having us remove our shoes, Alex. But one of the things that for me it's ironic is if you step back and look at people removing their shoes, what do you see? We actually bend over, right? This is like bending over before the kings. There they are, the government badge people. We are untying our shoes, bending over, removing our shoes. Psychologically, they are training us to see them as the superior gods,
Okay, so the point that Sibel is making in this clip is that, well, she starts out saying, because she was a whistleblower from the FBI, got in big trouble for blowing the whistle, which means to tell the truth. And when you have a government where people get in trouble for telling the truth, you've got problems right out of the gate, or you should, if you're awake at all. When she's saying when she blew the whistle and they persecuted her for it, they want her to, as she said, they fired me, that they want to see her just cry. They fired me, they destroyed my life. And what she did about it instead was she wrote her book. In fact, she's written a couple books now. She went out and she pushed the issue. She didn't let herself be shut up. Now, throughout my ordeal with Meannesota, everyone has told me these stupid responses like, just let it go. You can't fight City Hall, just let it go, move on with your life, this kind of stuff. And what that amounts to is they want me to just go about my business and stew in the knowledge that these people destroyed my life, which in my case I couldn't do anyway because they so completely destroyed my life that I'm actually in peril of dying. So I don't have the leisure to go get some other job and sit around and stew over what they did to me. But like Sibel, I created my website and I have pushed this issue. The reason is because that's what a responsible citizen, a responsible whistleblower is supposed to do. That's exactly what we're supposed to do, is to never give up, to push it until people finally get it. Now she's done this. She's been blessed that because of her higher level and more publicity, she has a lot more people behind her, more resources, and she's able to do a lot more. She has a news service and everything. I didn't have that, so I had to put all of my resources into my website, Meannesota.com. But the point is, I'm not just going to sit there. They did destroy my life, and I'm going to tell everybody they destroyed my life, but I'm not just going to sit there and wallow in that and stew over it. I'm trying to do something about it. And ideally, this will end up with some attorney outside of Meannesota, aka a competent attorney, who will recognize what happened to me and help me take action against these individuals in this state who destroyed my life. But even if that doesn't happen, at least I'm getting the word out with my website. And these people who told me, why are you wasting your time with that website? Just let it go, get over it. How dare you say that? These people destroyed my life, and they're going to do it to someone else if somebody doesn't stop them. And while my website, my YouTube channel may not be much, it's a very humble attempt to get the word out. It's all I can do. But you know what? I did it. I didn't give up. I did it. I did the right thing once again. And to all those people who told me that I shouldn't waste time with the website and I should just let it go and move on, I'm pointing a finger at you, and I'll let you guess which finger it is. Because you're just a lazy bum if you think I should let it go and let these people go on and destroy other people's lives without even trying to stop them. How dare you? In the name of all those people who are going to be destroyed in the future, how dare you tell me to just let it go when I know that that's what's going to happen? That's like telling someone who was raped, just let it go, just get over it, don't push it. And you expect that child who went through something of that kind of trauma and torment to go about their lives and, quote, just let it go and forgive and forget, when they know for a fact that the people who they are not aggressively pursuing are going to go out and rape other children after the fact? How dare anybody tell me to just let it go, forgive and forget? I'm trying to protect the people who will come after me who are going to have their lives destroyed. And that's exactly what Sibel is talking about in this clip. But that's another concept in Meannesota that nobody has been grasping. And that's why I'm playing this clip. I want to show you that people who are responsible don't sit there and just take it up the ass like that and say, oh, I've just got to let it go. I've got to just move on. It's like, no, you have to stop those perpetrators from doing it again. That's what you have to do. That's what makes you responsible, while all these people who tell you to just let it go are utterly irresponsible. Toward the end of this clip, she points out another issue, getting back to the concept of conditioning. She's talking about the TSA and how when the TSA forces you to go through all these rituals of being groped, and in another clip she talks about how her daughter, I think at the time her daughter was 4 years old, how she would go home and tell her daughter, now, never let anybody touch you here. Never let anybody touch you like this. If anybody ever touches you like this, you tell us. And then they get on a plane and the TSA just manhandles and fondles this little girl. Okay, and the little girl comes to her mother and says, they touched me the way you told me people aren't supposed to. That's our government fondling children. God. I cannot believe people are not outraged about this stuff. Nobody takes action against this kind of thing. That's what she's trying to point out here, is that people get conditioned by that to accept that as normal. And if you would accept that as normal, then you will accept the occasional disappearance of one of your friends while a new FEMA camp opens up over here, or you see the smoke rising from an oven over there. You'll accept that too. You'll accept anything if you'll accept the government fondling children right in front of their parents. I cannot believe how lazy Americans have become, how sickening. People who just don't take action against this kind of behavior. One more clip from Sibel, again on Alex Jones. Here she's going to talk some more about conditioning.
This one man, which tells you the power of it. This is why I get upset, because I'm talking with these people, Alex, and they say, well, what are you going to do? If you're going to be either Romney or Obama. And I say, why don't you vote third candidate, an alternative? They automatically, they say, oh, they're not electables. I say, who says so? And they can't explain. Do you know why? They don't know why they are saying it. They see it on the media. They see it on the newspaper. They hear it every day. Oh, Larry King. Oh, yeah. Even when they say Ron Paul is cool, I like him, of course he's not electable. Well, you say that 100 times a day, people are going to start like parrots repeating it. And so when I grill them, I say, why do you think he's not electable? What if you and everyone who says Ron Paul is not electable, a third party, third candidate, independent is not electable, go and cast a vote and say, I'm going to do it because I'm disgusted with the two anyway. I'm not going to take the lesser of the two evils because what is it? One ranks 100 in the scale of being evil, and the other one ranks 99. I'm going to vote for the other guy who's 99% evil. Great. That's not the mentality we need. What will happen if you cast vote and everybody who says that there is this, again, media, education system, universities, the academia, they repeat it. This is like brainwashing. So people walking around like robots saying, oh, I think Ron Paul is a great guy, but he's not electable. Why? Well, he's just not electable. He's just too different and he doesn't, but they can't really put anything. Then some of the other ones, they say things like this, oh, because he's racist. I say, really? Leslie, I come from Middle Eastern background. I'm female. What makes you say Ron Paul is racist? Give me an example. They say, oh, I don't remember. I read it, New York Times said how he's with the skinheads. You see, this is the psychological warfare. This is the psyops. Psyops are not geared for Iraq or Afghanistan. The psyops happening here with elections in the United States on daily basis. How many people are exposing that we are under psyops? And you know what? When you and I say this, Alex, nutcases.
Okay, now that was pretty self-explanatory. The way that this one relates to me in particular is, and I don't think I've mentioned this one yet, but during the Third World American Project, I ran for public office. And when I ran for public office, I learned a lot about how corrupt our system really is. Because what went on camera that the masses saw, as soon as that camera was turned off, it was as if a whole bunch of switches were flipped, because the whole attitude and demeanor, the way that things occurred off camera was unlike anything that you saw on camera. In my case, I had 8 people I was running against. One of them never bothered to show up to anything, so I was effectively running against 7. At the end of every public forum where we would all sit up there and talk, the whole audience would just walk straight over to me and ignore the other 7. Because I was the only one who knew what was going on, who could articulate the problems, and who could propose solutions in enough detail that the people knew that I knew what I was talking about and that I was going to do exactly what I said. And yet, the mass media portrayed it completely differently. They portrayed it as if their chosen candidate, the one that they wanted in office, had somehow won the forum. And one of the things was, because of that, all those people who would come up to me at the forums and say, thank God, finally somebody I feel good about voting for. It didn't take very long of the mass media marginalizing me just in the press and boosting these useless candidates who they wanted to win, these people who didn't even know what was going on, let alone have any proposals. It didn't take long of that before these voters who were watching this happen on television quickly came to the conclusion that I was unelectable, mainly because the press kept telling them that there's no way I could ever win. So what happened was, after a couple of these forums where everything went so well, I started getting, the people would still come over and talk to me, but their tune had changed. Instead of being enthusiastic about me winning, they started saying, gee, Paul, I really feel bad. I mean, you're obviously by far the best candidate, but I'm just thinking now I can't vote for you because you're not going to win and I don't want to waste my vote. What they're basically saying is you're unelectable. And that's exactly what Sibel mentioned in this clip here. And she's asking the question, where did they get that idea? If I'm the best candidate, I should have won, right? After the first forums, everyone comes over to talk to me. They completely ignored every other candidate. So where did they get the idea that I couldn't win? It's like everybody liked me. It's because the media, because there were only 30 or 50 people at those forums, but the media was talking to tens of thousands of people. And they knew that. So when they saw that the media was marginalizing me and boosting up these ignorant fools who were only in it for their own business interests, they didn't care anything about public service. When they saw that happening on television, they came to the conclusion that there's no way I was going to win this election, and they didn't want to, quote, waste their vote. Well, friends, they did waste their vote because they did not vote for me. Not only was I the best candidate, but they wanted me to win. That's why I never go into the ballot box and choose any candidate except the one who I want in that office. And if that means I have to write in a name for every single office, I will sit there for an hour and write in a name for every single office. But Americans, people just don't behave that way. When you get to something like Meannesota, we're right back to what I was talking about before. How did we end up with such a lousy group of do-nothing sloths in public office? These people won't even just do their jobs. They won't even do it poorly. They won't do it at all. I mean, they won't even listen to you. Just lazy bums. Well, they got in there because the masses were convinced that good candidates were unelectable, and they didn't use their own critical thinking skills to figure out that they were being manipulated when they did that, and that they ended up wasting their vote by giving their vote to someone who they did not want to see in office. It's just amazing. But look at that. My point is that Sibel is pointing this out, and she's not the only one. Every clip I'm playing for you, these sentiments have been stated by person after person after person after person. The reason I'm pointing out these clips and how they support what I said on my website is because here in Minnesota, people who are exposed to my website have it stuck in their head somehow that this is just a website of a guy who's lashing out at other people. And Sibel at the end of this clip mentioned, like, you know, well, if they don't like what you're saying, they just call you a conspiracy theorist or a nutcase or crazy or something like that. And I think one of the things that hurt me the very most was when one of the few people in this state out of the 9 years I'd been here who I cared the most about, 5 million people here, and there's probably 3 people I really cared about. One of them said, people look at your website and they think you're crazy. Now, how am I supposed to feel, given everything else I've said, not just on the website and YouTube, but in just this one video, everything I've said about what I did with Third World American, what I have done to try to stand up for other people, tried to stand up for what is right, try to do the right thing, even though it does put me at risk, requires sacrifice. Try to make sure that nobody else comes after me and suffers the same way I did because I try to stop it. The thought that anyone, anywhere, legitimately, not just people who disagree with me and want to, discredit me, but people who are anywhere near me would even suggest that I'm crazy just because they don't understand what I'm doing tells you just how far these people have fallen away from common sense, let alone the details of all this stuff I'm talking about. These people are asleep at the wheel. They are so asleep, they are so irresponsible that when they're faced with something that they can't process, that doesn't make sense to them, like why would this guy push the issue of neighbor noise to such a huge degree? They can't figure out that there's a lot more to it that they don't understand, mainly because they don't bother to learn about it, so they can't understand it. So what do? They just blow it off. They actually feel more comfortable taking someone who they know and saying, you're crazy, than to go do the work that they need to do so that they can get in a similar situation to where I am, so they'll understand exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. Now, Sibel points that out right here in this clip, how people came to her and they would just say, you're crazy. Why are you pushing this? You've got a gag order. You could go to prison. Your daughter could be raised with a mother who's in prison. You're crazy. And she's sitting there saying, what? I'm doing the right thing. I'm trying to make sure my daughter grows up in a nation where parents don't go to prison for telling the truth, so that kids don't grow up with parents who are in prison just because the parents did the right thing. She's trying to do the work to make sure that doesn't happen, and people call her crazy? Reminds me of what it says in the Bible, that in the end times, when things really degenerate toward hell, that people will claim that good is evil and that evil is good. It's just so upside down and backwards, it boggles my mind. The people who would say that I'm crazy or that I'm going overboard with this Meannesota, if they had actually done anything, if they had read a book, if they could speak articulately on the subject at all, and they had any concept of what I'm talking about, and if they demonstrated any concern whatsoever for those people who are going to be raped and abused by these same authorities who screwed me over later, if they showed any concern for those people, I might accept what they have to say. I might give it a little credibility. But the problem is they don't care. If 10,000 people have their lives destroyed after I had mine destroyed, these people still don't care. Because they know me personally, they say, well, why don't you just let it go? You're crazy to be pushing this. Then they just forget all about even 10,000 people who come after me and get destroyed. It sickens me. It's just sickening. It's absolutely sickening. But that's Meannesota. Everyone I'm talking about here is in Meannesota. And because they're in Minnesota, they obviously are dominated by the cult of Meannesota. Alright, well that's all the clips I have for Sibel. I'm going to put out a couple more videos. They're going to be much shorter than this. But they feature other people who will have statements that I can relate to Meannesota and help back up that what I've been saying all along is not at all odd or strange or crazy. It is exactly what responsible, good, decent human beings should be talking about. I appreciate you listening to this rather long video, and I do hope it helped to clarify some things. If anything I said in this video finally broke through and started to make some sense to you, please visit my website, Meannesota.com, read my story, learn about it, read the whole thing, and please, it has gotten absolutely desperate for me in terms of survival. I would greatly appreciate it if you would click the donate button in the lower left-hand corner and help me to survive this. Thanks again, everyone.